Lucifer. Carlson stood on the hill in the silent center of the city whose people had died. He stared up at the building, the one structure that dwarfed every hotel grid, skyscraper needle, or apartment cheesebox packed into all the miles that lay about him. Tall as a mountain, it caught the rays of the bloody sun. Somehow it turned their red into golden halfway up its height. Carlson suddenly felt that he should not have come back. It had been over 2 years, as he figured it, since last he had been here. He wanted to return to the mountains now. One look was enough, yet still he stood before it, transfixed by the huge building, by the long shadow that bridged the entire valley. He shrugged his thick shoulders then, in an unsuccessful attempt to shake off memories of the days, 5 or was it 6 years ago, when he had worked within the giant unit. Then he climbed the rest of the way up the hill and entered the high, wide doorway. His fiber sandals cast a variety of echoes as he passed through the deserted offices and into the long hallway that led to the belts. The belts, of course, were still. There were no thousands riding them. There was no one alive to ride. Their deep belly rumble was only a noisy phantom in his mind as he climbed onto the one nearest him and walked ahead into the pitchy insides of the place. It was like a mausoleum. There seemed no ceiling, no walls, only the soft pat-pat of his soles on the flexible fabric of the belt. He reached a junction and mounted a crossbelt, instinctively standing still for a moment and waiting for the forward lurch as it sensed his weight. Then he chuckled silently and began walking again. When he reached the lift, he set off to the right of it until his memory led him to the maintenance stairs. Shouldering his bundle, he began the long, groping ascent. He blinked at the light when he came into the power room. Filtered through its 100 high windows, the sunlight trickled across the dusty acres of machinery. Carlson sagged against the wall, breathing heavily from the climb. After a while, he wiped a workbench clean and set down his parcel. Then he removed his faded shirt, for the place would soon be stifling. He brushed his hair from his eyes and advanced down the narrow metal stair to where the generators stood, row on row, like an army of dead black beetles. It took him 6 hours to give them all a cursory check. He selected 3 in the second row and systematically began tearing them down, cleaning them, soldering their loose connections with the auto-iron, greasing them, oiling them, and sweeping away all the dust, cobwebs, and pieces of cracked insulation that lay at their bases. Great rivulets of perspiration ran into his eyes and down along his sides and thighs, spilling in little droplets onto the hot flooring and vanishing quickly. Finally, he put down his broom, remounted the stair, and returned to his parcel. He removed one of the water bottles and drank off half its contents. He ate a piece of dried meat and finished the bottle. He allowed himself 1 cigarette then, and returned to work. He was forced to stop when it grew dark. He had planned on sleeping right there, but the room was too oppressive. So he departed the way he had come and slept beneath the stars on the roof of a low building at the foot of the hill. It took him 2 more days to get the generators ready. Then he began work on the huge broadcast panel. It was in better condition than the generators because it had last been used 2 years ago, whereas the generators, save for the 3 he had burned out last time, had slept for over 5, or was it 6 years? He soldered and wiped and inspected until he was satisfied. Then only one task remained. All the maintenance robots stood frozen in mid-gesture. Carlson would have to wrestle a 300-pound power cube without assistance. If he could get one down from the rack and onto a cart without breaking a wrist, he would probably be able to convey it to the igniter without much difficulty. Then he would have to place it within the oven. He had almost ruptured himself when he did it 2 years ago, but he hoped that he was somewhat stronger and luckier this time. It took him 10 minutes to clean the igniter oven. Then he located a cart and pushed it back to the rack. One cube was resting at just the right height, approximately 8 inches above the level of the cart's bed. He kicked down the anchor chocks and moved around to study the rack. The cube lay on a downward slanting shelf restrained by a 2-inch metal guard. He pushed at the guard. It was bolted to the shelf. Returning to the work area, he searched the toolboxes for a wrench. Then he moved back to the rack and set to work on the nuts. The guard came loose as he was working on the 4th nut. He heard a dangerous creak and threw himself back out of the way, dropping the wrench on his toes. The cube slid forward, crushed the loosened rail, teetered a bare moment, then dropped with a resounding crash onto the heavy bed of the cart. The bed surface bent and began to crease beneath its weight. The cart swayed toward the outside. The cube continued to slide until over half a foot projected beyond the edge. Then the cart righted itself and shivered into steadiness. Carlson sighed and kicked loose the chocks, ready to jump back should it suddenly give way in his direction. It held. Gingerly he guided it up the aisle and between the rows of generators until he stood before the igniter. He anchored the cart again, stopped for water and a cigarette, then searched up a pinch bar, a small jack, and a long, flat metal plate. He laid the plate to bridge the front end of the cart and the opening to the oven. He wedged the far end in beneath the igniter's doorframe. Unlocking the rear chocks, he inserted the jack and began to raise the back end of the wagon slowly, working with one hand and holding the bar ready in the other. The cart groaned as it moved higher. Then a sliding, grating sound began, and he raised it faster. With a sound like the stroke of a cracked bell, the cube tumbled onto the bridgeway. It slid forward and to the left. He struck at it with the bar, bearing to the right with all his strength. About half an inch of it caught against the left edge of the oven frame. The gap between the cube and the frame was widest at the bottom. He inserted the bar and heaved his weight against it 3 times. Then it moved forward and came to rest within the igniter. He began to laugh. He laughed until he felt weak. He sat on the broken cart, swinging his legs and chuckling to himself until the sounds coming from his throat seemed alien and out of place. He stopped abruptly and slammed the door. The broadcast panel had 1,000 eyes, but none of them winked back at him. He made the final adjustments for transmit, then gave the generators their last checkout. After that, he mounted a catwalk and moved to a window. There was still some daylight to spend, so he moved from window to window, pressing the open button set below each sill. He ate the rest of his food then, and drank a whole bottle of water and smoked 2 cigarettes. Sitting on the stair, he thought of the days when he had worked with Kelly and Murchison and Jasinski, twisting the tails of electrons until they wailed and leapt out over the walls and fled down into the city. The clock! He remembered it suddenly, set high on the wall to the left of the doorway, frozen at 9:33 and 48 seconds. He moved a ladder through the twilight and mounted it to the clock. He wiped the dust from its greasy face with a sweeping circular movement. Then he was ready. He crossed to the igniter and turned it on. Somewhere the ever batteries came alive, and he heard a click as a thin, sharp shaft was driven into the wall of the cube. He raced back up the stairs and sped hand over hand up to the catwalk. He moved to a window and waited. "God," he murmured, "don't let them blow. Please don't." Across an eternity of darkness, the generators began humming. He heard a crackle of static from the broadcast panel, and he closed his eyes. The sound died. He opened his eyes as he heard the window slide upward. All around him, the 100 high windows opened. A small light came on above the bench in the work area below him, but he did not see it. He was staring out beyond the wide drop of the Acropolis and down into the city. His city. The lights were not like the stars. They beat the stars all to hell. They were the gay, regularized constellation of a city where men made their homes. Even rows of street lamps, advertisements, lighted windows in the cheesebox apartments, a random solitaire of bright squares running up the sides of skyscraper needles, a searchlight swiveling its luminous antenna through cloud banks that hung over the city. He dashed to another window, feeling the high night breezes comb at his beard. Belts were humming below. He heard their wry monologues rattling through the city's deepest canyons. He pictured the people in their homes, in theaters, in bars, talking to each other, sharing a common amusement, playing clarinets, holding hands, eating an evening snack. Sleeping row-cars awakened and rushed past each other on the levels above the belts. The background hum of the city told him its story of production, of function, of movement and service to its inhabitants. The sky seemed to wheel overhead as though the city were its turning hub and the universe its outer rim. Then the lights dimmed from white to yellow, and he hurried with desperate steps to another window. "No, not so soon! Don't leave me yet!" he sobbed. The windows closed themselves, and the lights went out. He stood on the walk for a long time, staring at the dead embers. A smell of ozone reached his nostrils. He was aware of a blue halo about the dying generators. He descended and crossed the work area to the ladder he had set against the wall. Pressing his face against the glass and squinting for a long time, he could make out the position of the hands. 9:35 and 21 seconds, Carlson read. "Do you hear that?" he called out, shaking his fist at anything. 93 seconds! I made you live for 93 seconds! Then he covered his face against the darkness and was silent. After a long while he descended the stairway, walked the belt, and moved through the long hallway and out of the building. As he headed back toward the mountains, he promised himself again that he would never return.